having Truffaut and Godard sit down and say, I don't think movies are everything that they could be.
Yeah.
And I think we can change that in
I think
indie
we gotta
movies.
assemble a team.
Yeah, we gotta put a team together.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Cannes Canon, the show where we look at Cannes competition filmmakers' past films to better understand their work. And so today we're going to start with my fifth team pick, which is Oliver Laxe. This is a filmmaker that I'm quite interested in. He is going into the competition for the very first time this year with Sirat. And he hasn't made a film in 6 years. Yet, he's only in his 40s, and so he might have a bright future ahead of him, and a future where we talk about him a little bit more, because so far his films have been relegated to very specific kind of art house circles or like very deep cinephilia.
Yeah, at this point, he was one of the filmmakers that I was completely unfamiliar with. He's moved up quite a bit.
Yeah,
for my anticipation.
Once you start to know the filmmakers, you get more excited about them.
Yeah, and I think he has a very distinct vision.
Oliver Laxe, he is a Galician filmmaker, Galician being the northwest region of Spain. So this year, just like with Carlos Simón, we have a Spanish film that isn't what we imagine a Spanish filmmaker to be like, because they are not from the heart of Spain or the kind of Madrid center. They are from a region that speaks another language. However, Laxe has had an interesting journey through life. He was born in France, actually. He was born in Paris, went back to Galicia, lived in other parts of Spain for a bit, and I think he lived and might still currently be living in Morocco. So he has been kind of in this corner of the world for a good chunk of his life. He's also worked with filmmakers like Ben Rivers in the past. Ben Rivers is not a filmmaker I'm very familiar with, but he's an experimental filmmaker who is, again, also within that kind of deep cinephilia pocket of filmmakers. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that Oliver Laxe is basically the equivalent to Miguel Gomes.
That's what I was going to say.
His first film was in 2010. It's called You Are All Captains. It premiered in the Director's Fortnight category at Cannes, so he was always in the Cannes Club from the beginning. And his second film, Mimosas, was in the Cannes Critics Week and won the top prize in that selection. And then his next film, Fire Will Come, is where I think he really started to break through, because in part he won the jury prize in the Un Certain Regard side section of Cannes. And I think that kind of trajectory, and then maybe working with Sergio Lopez on this new film, is finally getting Laxe the chance of going into the Cannes competition this year.
Something that fascinates me about his films is that despite being from the northwest of Spain, despite being Parisian born, he focuses so deeply on North Africa.
I know that he's very fascinated by Islamic culture and spirituality to a certain extent, but not necessarily driven by faith towards a specific religion. You know, he's not drawn to it because he wants to film Islam necessarily. It's more so themes he likes to explore, or like the subjects that interest him are often related to spiritual writing, but also to skepticism. And I think he's also very clearly interested in landscapes.
I like beauty. I need beauty. It's like a fire where I can put my hands when I'm cold, when I'm cold inside, and I always will have this fire to warm my soul. So
I don't think he restricts himself to one particular landscape, even if they're geographically not too far apart from each other. Going from Mimosas to Fire Will Come, you can't have more different landscapes than that. You go from mountainous deserts, donkeys, mules, and whatnot, to this incredibly rich, green, forested, much more of a cool climate too, not far from the Atlantic Ocean, that you have in the Galician rural landscapes of Fire Will Come.
One of the LETTERBOXD reviews that I read about Mimosas that really cracked me up was someone said, this movie is like Lord of the Rings if Tolkien based it on the Quran instead of the Bible. Yeah, I see that a lot. It's got this very intense spirituality to it. It turns sort of the mythology of Islam into something epic. And yet, I mean, it doesn't go for like the epic moments in the way that like the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies does, but it has that same sense of scope, that same sense of mysticism to it.
Like any filmmaker, you have to have your own approach to how you depict time. In Oliver Laxe's work so far, he always kind of challenges the way we view the events happening in the film, in time, their connection to one another, and especially in Mimosas, the way epochs come into play. What time does it feel like we are in based on the environments we're in?
And based on the costuming and just the details of the mise-en-scène. We could jump right into Mimosas if you'd like.
Let's jump into Mimosas.
So something really striking about this movie is how, like you were saying, it deals with time. Because this is a movie that feels, in a way, like it could be set 1,000 years ago in many parts. And it kind of is set in that time period. It's unchained from time. We see these characters interacting with taxis. We see them interacting with the modern era and modern Morocco. And yet they're also wandering through the mountains with nothing but a horse carrying their things, and you know they're dressed in garb that looks like it's taken from a different time period. It takes place both in the past and the present, or perhaps even the future.
That's the thing, is you might assume that it is happening in two different time frames and you're kind of following two distinct stories, or at least characters that are going to have their own storylines in very different periods of time, but you realize that they are interconnected and we're seeing the same story. At least the way I'm interpreting it, you could perhaps interpret it as there's almost like this portal into the past that happens at some point. I think it is happening essentially at the same time, and even if we don't necessarily anticipate people in garbs, like you say, carrying mules around in the mountains to be of our time, I mean, it is in our time. It happens in the Himalayas all the time, and it can happen in the Moroccan Atlas as well. What really sells this idea when you watch the film is the fact that you never see exactly the moment where those two worlds merge. You know, you see the taxi cab going into rolling into the plain for the more faithful character, joining a caravan in the mountains, but you never see the moment where he changes clothes, where he starts walking into the mountains. He just pops up. And likewise, film, when they are to return to the city, you don't see that transition done as well. There still is a separation between those two worlds. It's a separation that could almost be interpreted as, the urban and the mystique. Because there's something bigger than humans. There's something a little bit godly happening in the mountains. And maybe that's just the spectacular nature of these landscapes. I don't know.
And it is so interesting that the more faithful character that we get, the one who is more spiritual, is from the present, is the one in the taxi cab, is the one who is sort of delivered into this story. And the ones who are less faithful are the ones who are living in this more mystical time, that are tasked with this goal of carrying the dead Shah's body back to his home so that he can be buried where he lived. Just to think about the way that it uses time, it inspires me so much, and I want to see more movies that feel less chained to, well, we're going to set this movie in this year, which means we have to be accurate to this, this, and this. Oliver Laxe is onto something here.
It's a story that takes this kind of legendary importance, in part because you have this epic conflict between two characters who are very much on opposing ends. You have the man with faith and the skeptic. It's a film, yes, about trying to accomplish a task, but it's a film about these two ideologies clashing. How do these characters interact, and how does it motivate the quest they're on? And sometimes there are some very dire consequences. I'm thinking especially about, slight spoilers. They eventually decide, oh, we can't really do this journey anymore. We're just gonna bury him here and forget about it. But of course there are bandits around, and that is how this character winds up getting shot to death. You have, the man of faith who already kind of sees this as a human loss and cannot bear the emotion. These are the kinds of scenes I really relish.
What is being implied there is that had they kept the faith, had they kept the promise that they made, that they would bring the Shah back to his home turf, that he wouldn't have died. It's divine punishment for cheaping out on a task that you were given.
يلا صاحبي يلا هذا هو الوقت يلا هذا هو الوقت.
كندرو لها وجه الفرعون كندرو لها.
بالحب بالحب يا وجبر بالحب بالحب.
So the next filmmaker to profile today will be Richard Linklater, the famed American director. I think a filmmaker that many of you out there are probably familiar with in one way or another. Linklater was a bit of a slacker through his school years, ended up dropping out of college and going to work on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. And it was there that he decided, you know what, I want to be a filmmaker. So he moved to Austin, Texas after this, enrolled in school, and ended up founding the Austin Film Society in 1985, which later led to the founding of the South by Southwest Arts Festival. Linklater's work bounces between indie darlings like Dazed and Confused, Before Sunrise, Boyhood, or Waking Life, and box office hits for the mainstream like School of Rock or Bad News Bears. And his long, time-spanning epics like Boyhood, which took 12 years to film, or Merrily We Roll Along, which we won't be seeing for probably another 18 years. Richard Linklater, I know, is one of my personal favorite American filmmakers. I think he's endlessly interesting, and I actually don't think he gets enough credit for what he does. I think that not only is he a fun filmmaker to watch, he's also incredibly formally daring and always pushing boundaries. But I gotta ask you, because I feel like everyone has a different introduction to Richard Linklater and his works. What was your first exposure to Richard Linklater?
Oh, yeah, it must have been Boyhood.
Really?
Yeah,
That's late.
It
You
is
didn't
late,
have any
but-
childhood Linklaters.
No, I did not.
No School of Rock.
Yeah, Boyhood was my first Linklater, and I fell in love with it. I thought it was one of my favorite films of that year.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with your sentiment in that Richard Linklater has been active for over like 35 years.
35 years.
And like he has a really deep filmography, and he has some classics, And I feel like sometimes he's a little bit too defined by his classics
Those
and
are to
his
different
gimmick
people.
movies, gimmick in quotation marks. His filmography has a lot of variety.
Rather than calling it a gimmick, I like calling it formal experimentation. And when we talk about Richard Linklater in the Cannes competition this year, he's bringing us Nouvelle Vague, which is an examination of the set of Breathless, 1960 French New Wave film directed by Jean-Luc Godard, who was probably the forefather of the French New Wave movement. And in a similar way, I think you could say that Richard Linklater is the godfather or the forefather of the American indie movement of the 1990s. And I think there's a lot of similarities between the two. And in that way, there's no better choice that you could make for an American filmmaker.
It's odd because you wouldn't necessarily think about him because
No.
he's not a French filmmaker, and this is the first time he's operating in a different language, I'm pretty sure. But he's a hangout movie director.
Yeah.
And as much as I don't want to reduce Linklater to his dialogue writing, he is very well known for his dialogue writing. It's not all that he should be known for, but he is one of those directors where you can watch the film, listen to the kind of dialogue, whether it's philosophical meanderings or a kind of lighthearted, a certain sense of humor, and you recognize that that's a Richard Linklater film.
Yes.
Hitman is a popular film, but you listen to the dialogue and it feels Richard Linklater.
There's a cadence to his dialogue, and it really comes across through the philosophy that the characters are spouting. A lot of the time, their conversations go absolutely nowhere.
Yeah.
And it's not even like going nowhere in a Tarantino way, it's going nowhere in a specifically Linklater way, which is very much like a novel. And I think that's just a magical thing that he does, and we don't see that in a lot of other films. But beyond his dialogue, the level of formal experimentation that he uses. Nobody had ever seen anything like Boyhood before. To an extent, you could say the same thing about Waking Life, right? Because we'd seen rotoscoped films before, but never in that way. And the Before trilogy in general. There's so many ideas coming through his works. At his core, he is radical in the way that he approaches cinema, the way that he questions what can a movie be. He's breaking the form, he's challenging what we know. And in that way, I think he is the perfect American to take on a movie about the French New Wave. Because what is the French New Wave? It's a group of young filmmakers challenging the dominant idea of what cinema is.
There's something that's oddly fitting about just having a bunch of Parisians sit around at a coffee and just talking about making a movie.
And philosophizing what is a movie. Having Truffaut and Godard sit down and say, I don't think movies are everything that they could be.
Yeah.
And I think we can change that. In
I think
indie
we gotta
movement.
assemble a team.
Yeah, we got to put a team together. But the film I wish we were profiling here is Slacker, which was his second feature film. Watching that, it could have been made by Godard.
And without any main characters,
No main character.
just a bunch of vignettes. Already he was like testing things and trying to be radical to
Pushing
a certain
the
extent.
limits of
Exactly.
what is a movie.
But what isn't really pushing the limits? The film that we're going to be profiling, Fast Food Nation, because strangely enough, the only film that Richard Linklater has ever made that has been accepted into the Cannes competition.
Yeah, one of two films that have played at Cannes by Richard Linklater. And frankly, if Nouvelle Vague was not about the French New Wave, it probably would not be at Cannes. If we look historically at why Fast Food Nation was picked as part of the Cannes lineup, and granted, this is a forgotten part of his filmography. This is not a film that's spoken about very much. I think we can both see the reason why.
Yeah,
it's not
for
really a
good reason,
notable
yeah.
film. It was 2006. This is the middle of the second term of George W. Bush. In 2004, we had the Palme d'Or go to Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11. A film like this, Fast Food Nation, criticizing America's dependence on fast food, that was a topic that I think the Cannes Film Festival thought was important enough to include in the competition, even though the film really isn't doing anything to warrant a spot in the prestigious competition.
It has many problems, but
Yes.
if I am to try to summarize the problems it has, I think it's basically just the style that Richard Linklater brings to the table in most of his films just doesn't fit. What is supposed to be a Robert Altman-esque ensemble expose of the fast food industry. The film has three threads. It's got Mexican immigrants kind of coming into the United States and being forced to be cheap labor for the meatpacking industry. Greg Kinnear, who is a marketing executive at a fictional burger company who has to investigate by himself whether or not there's shit in the meat, as they put it. And then you have this other thread led by Ashley Johnson, who is initially a fast food employee at the cash register, but then kind of goes on to college and learns about environmental issues and eco-terrorism and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it becomes radical in a way.
Alongside Avril Lavigne,
Yes,
which
lots of
particularly
celebrity
helped
cameos in this one. It almost feels like the George Bush era Adam McKay style film. Like this is the Don't Look Up of that time.
I guess so.
For me, I think the main problem I have with Fast Food Nation is that it's saying a whole lot of things and it's saying none of them very well. I don't know what this film is trying to tell me. They saw all of these documentaries, these political documentaries that were going around, Michael Moore, Morgan Spurlock. I mean, this is coming just a year after Super Size Me came out. This progressive cinema was, we're gonna look at different problems that America has and we're gonna criticize the hell out of them. But that works really well in documentary. And not so well when you're trying to operate in this Robert Altman mode, because it's criticizing so many different things, but not really pinpointing any of them. It is at the same time talking about the treatment of migrant workers. It is talking about health and safety regulations being overlooked because of profits. It's talking about young people feeling dissociated and sort of detached from their work. It's also talking about the animal cruelty that this industry is based on. And then it's also talking about America as a nation consuming so much fast food. And so the unhealthy habits that Americans have at large, but it's not lasering into a single one of those points.
I don't know if I have an issue with that specifically. And I think what Richard Linklater does is show that there's a certain complexity. It's inevitable in this particular system to have shit in the meat and nobody is gonna give a shit anyways. I wouldn't have wanted this to be like a film that's trying to tell me something particularly.
But it is.
But ultimately what the film just does is it tells you this issue is happening, it's a complex issue, and then just kind of leaves you at that. I didn't really get that much out of it after that. And like, I think the moment I realized the film had kind of failed me, at the very end of the film, you have this Mexican immigrant who is finally given a job. That job, of course, being one of the most disgusting jobs in the factory, where you have to see like the guts and the intestines of the recently killed cows. One of them is even open up and there's just shit everywhere. Thus, you know, concluding that arc, I guess. But then we cut back to her face and there's just a single tear rolling down and I'm just feeling nothing. Because I don't understand, if you're going for like this emotional reaction, what was the point of your film beyond trying to make me feel bad for everything that's happening, I guess? Like, there's not an aesthetic reason for being of the film beyond we know this is an important issue and we want to communicate this information.
The thing that we get in a lot of these films is just like, here's the problem, and we're all gonna say you gotta solve it, but there's nothing we can really do right now. I feel like there's something about Fast Food Nation and that Bush era sensibility that isn't jaded enough. It's not quite jaded enough.
It doesn't feel like sensational enough to be like militant or you know, driving, and it's not politically, economically savvy enough to feel like this very clinical or almost fly on the wall documentary but fictionalized version of this kind of industry. And it's just kind of a middle, like, nothing burger.
It is a sad fact of life, Don. But the truth is, we all have to eat a little shit from time to time. But just for the record, I want you to know that I'm with you on this, okay? I really am. I'm gonna go down there, we'll see what the hell's going on. If I have to, I'm gonna kick some ass.
You know what, Harry? I don't think that's gonna be good enough.
You seem like a real bright guy, Don. I hate to see you get caught up in something you couldn't get out of.
But that is it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed our profile of these two filmmakers and look forward to tomorrow's episode back at Cannes, back on the Croisette.